When I began preparing for the message this week, I was under the impression we finished Luke chapter 6 last week, and that we'd be moving on to another event in the life of Jesus, and that the teaching was, as you go through, I mean, it's obvious that there's these different events that happen. And I really thought that we were leaving the last 3 weeks we've been studying a sermon that Jesus gave in Luke chapter 6. And it took us 3 weeks to get through it, and I thought we were finished with it. Well, you're going to see that this morning we're not really finished with that sermon. As I studied, and I can't say that I'm the one who is the originator of these thoughts, but as I studied and read some other scholars, I was made aware that this isn't the next event in Jesus' life. This is really the conclusion and the application of the message that Jesus just finished giving in this the last number of weeks. Well, later on, we're going to get to the Good Samaritan. That's coming up in Luke chapter 10. And it's an interesting parable because part of the point of the lesson in the Good Samaritan, part of the point that Jesus is making is that the hero in the story is not the expected hero. The hero in the story he's not Jewish. And that's a big deal for those that Jesus is teaching to. Well, today, we're going to see the same thing, except that there's a difference. This time, it's not a parable. This is an actual story in Jesus' life. The Gentile becomes the hero. And if you'll remember last week, we saw that Jesus' sermon didn't end with a challenge to build on that good foundation. He ended up saying, here are these two foundations. There's a good foundation and a bad foundation. It's your choice as to which one you want to build on, except he didn't say it's your choice. He seemed to leave that question hanging. And as we read through these next few verses in chapter 7 now, I want us to see that Jesus didn't leave it hanging. He actually arranged for a much better conclusion, and I'll show you what I mean as we go through the passage. He did what only he could do. He knew the future. He can arrange things. God is sovereign. He has this ability, but it's quite amazing. So listen as I read Luke chapter 7. We're going to start with the first 10 verses. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he's talking about this sermon that he's just preached to these huge crowds. He's out on the close to the Sea of Galilee, and he's preaching to them. When he had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. And there a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. That one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel." And then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So we have this interaction between Jesus and a Roman centurion. Well, as we saw, he didn't really have an interaction with him. He actually communicated through some intermediaries. The Jewish leaders of Capernaum came to Jesus and said, "Jesus, act on behalf of this man, please." And that is really the biggest clue that there's something strange going on here. There's something strange because the Jewish leaders, the Jewish authorities normally didn't have anything to do with Romans. The Romans were the occupiers. The Romans were the ones who enforced their taxation. The Romans were the ones who limited the freedoms of the Jewish people. The Romans were hated by the Jews. And yet, here is one who has found his way into their hearts to the extent that they would go and mediate for him. He was an enemy who didn't treat his enemy as the enemy. And it wasn't just that he was indifferent to the Jews. No, he actually gave in sacrificial ways so that his enemies could benefit. He built their synagogue. Remember in the sermon that we looked at, Luke chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus is in the sermon and he says this. He says, I tell you who hear me, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Okay, the Jews hated the Romans. They had no love for them. They didn't like the fact that they were occupiers. They didn't like the fact that they had to pay taxes. They didn't like anything about the Romans. They hated them. And yet here is a Roman who is loving his enemies and doing good to those who hate him. The Roman centurion is showing how this sermon is supposed to be applied. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. In fact, we're told in this passage that he built the synagogue for them. And that's why we're standing here in Capernaum in a synagogue, not the synagogue. The synagogue is actually right underneath this one. This one was built in about the 3rd or 4th century. The synagogue that this guy built, I'm going to see if I can show it to you. It's in the corner of this synagogue here, and there we go. So here we are in the corner. This is a black basalt, and the rest of Capernaum is all made out of this type of black lava type of basalt rock. And then right over here, up in here, you can see it turns whiter, and that's the newer synagogue. But this old black one is the one that the centurion built for the Jews. And it's also, obviously, this is the one that Jesus actually walked in and he preached in and visited. So it's not the greatest picture, so I'm going to change it back to the other one. But it gives a bit of perspective. I love the fact that when the Bible tells us some things, especially historical things like this, we can go to the source. We can go to Jerusalem. We can go to Israel. We can go to the Sea of Galilee. We can see these places that Jesus walked. We can see these buildings that Jesus walked in and taught in. And maybe the building's not there, but there's still foundations. There's still roads. On the steps of the southern Temple Mount in Jerusalem, there are steps where you're almost guaranteed that these very steps, Jesus walked up these steps. I love the fact that our faith is based in historical evidence. There's archaeological evidence. I heard one scholar say there is still yet many things to be proven by archaeology in the Bible, but there's nothing in the Bible that has ever been disproven by archaeology. And I love that. So here we are, we're standing in the second synagogue in Capernaum, standing over top of the one that this guy built for the Jews. Back to the centurion. He's not just a Roman, though. He's a Roman centurion. So he has this position of authority, and he's a leader. He's a commander of troops. And yet, somehow, this man has been impacted by the Jewish faith. He hasn't embraced it for his own yet. If he had become a full proselyte or a full convert to the Jewish faith, then really there would have been nothing stopping Jesus from going into his house. It looked like Jesus was planning on going into his house anyway. But the centurion was culturally sensitive enough to not want to put Jesus in that position. So not only is he a person who loves his enemies, but he's also a man of humility. For a Roman centurion to say to this traveling itinerant preacher, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. I'm not worthy to have you do this for me. He's a man of humility. What did Luke chapter 6 say? What did Jesus say in the sermon? He said, blessed are the poor, and Matthew expanded that a little bit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, that's an act of humility. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so here's this Roman centurion who has all the power, has all the authority, has all the position, and yet acts in a humble way. He does good to his enemies. He loves his enemies, and he does good to those who hate him. Jesus in the sermon said, lend without expecting to get anything back. Well, here we are. He has built this synagogue for them. There's no way that they can repay him for the synagogue. And yet he is given willingly. He's not expected anything back. All of these things, all of these points in the sermons that Jesus gave, he's following through on. He's a man of integrity. He's a man of character. He's a man of gracious words. And the fruit of his life, remember last week, no tree bears good fruit. No good tree bears bad fruit. No bad tree bears good fruit. A tree is recognized by its own fruit. And Jesus talked about how the workings of our hearts, the things that are in our hearts are going to be seen in the things that we do. Well, here is the demonstration of that. Here's this man who not only has he built this for them, not only has he shown respect to them, not only has he shown an attitude of humility, but he's got a servant. And this is obviously, we'll see why in a moment. He's a young servant. Now, servants in the Roman world are property. They are disposable, they are dispensable, you use them. If they get sick, you throw them away. You don't really care about them. And yet here's a centurion who has a young servant that he's willing to ask favors of the Jewish authorities to get Jesus to come and heal. He cares about this young servant. He's got the fruit of the spirit of kindness and goodness and gentleness. He shows that there's some work that's been going on in his heart. The first reference, the word that's used, he has a servant, and that's just your generic word for servant. But later on, when it says, when Jesus is talking to him, and it says, young man, it uses a more familiar term for him, young man. And so it's why would the centurion care about this young servant? And yet he does. His heart is changed. He is the example of all of these things that Jesus has been preaching about. This Roman centurion doesn't act like he's there to force his point of view and his way on others. But in humility, he sets his Roman point of view aside so that he can help the Jews around him. He sets, remember in that sermon, there's the taking the plank out of your own eye before you help take the speck out of your brother's eye. Well, this Roman centurion has this humility that he's willing to say, no, I'm not worthy for you to come. All of these things in this sermon are being evidenced in this man's life. He's bearing good fruit. He's built on a good foundation. And then finally, and the part that amazes Jesus so much, he says, Jesus, don't bother coming. All you have to do is say the word. I'm a man who understands authority. I say to one, go, and go, he comes. I say to another, come, and he comes. I say to this servant, do this, and he does it. I'm a man who gives orders, and I know that if you have this authority, you can just give the order and it's done. And Jesus marveled. He was amazed at this man's faith. He was amazed at his understanding of Jesus' power. He says, even in all of Israel, I have not seen such great faith. When I hear that, I guess I have to ask a few questions. See, whenever I read the Bible, I'm always asking questions. And in the passage that I'm reading, one of those questions that I always ask, is there an example for me to follow? Well, obviously, in this passage, there's an example for us to follow. Here's this Roman centurion who has no reason to act in the way that he does, and yet he's acting in a godly way. He's a Gentile. He has all the authority and all the power. He can do whatever he wants. He has the ability, and yet he doesn't take advantage of that. He loves his enemy. He does good to those who hate him. He lends without expecting anything in return. He has fruit of goodness and gentleness and concern for his servant. All of these things. And then he has this confidence in Jesus to say, Jesus, just say the word and it's done. Just say the word. What an example for us in the application of this sermon, but also just in the application of our faith. Jesus, say the word. Jesus was amazed by this Roman centurion's faith. Would Jesus be amazed by my faith? Would Jesus be amazed by your faith? What would I need to do in order for my faith to amaze Jesus? What might he ask me to do in order to display my faith to a greater extent? And those are questions that we need to wrestle through with as we pray and say, God, what can I do? How can I show my love for you more? How can I show my trust in you to a greater degree? Not that I can do anything that would, I don't expect I could do anything that would amaze Jesus. But is he pleased with my faith? Is my faith growing? Is my faith going in the right direction? Am I walking closer and closer towards Jesus? Or is Jesus kind of like this talisman that's on the shelf, and if I need a good favor, I go rub the talisman? If I need a good favor, yeah, then I'll pick up my Bible and I'll read a bit, and maybe I'll pray a bit. And it's more like the gumball machine, where I put my quarter in, I turn it, and I get the prize. That's not how Jesus is. Jesus wants to interact with us in a faith relationship. He wants us to have him as a part of our everyday life. He wants us close. What can we do that will be a greater demonstration of our faith in Jesus? Well, we've got a good example in this centurion.